Welcome everybody who's joining us today for Weed Detectives Plant Invaders. We are excited to offer this today. This is kind of a supplementary program to a pilot opportunity to get volunteers involved in helping us map invasive plants in our local community, particularly on state park lands. And Celeste Lebo, who is joining us today, had worked for state parks for a while and is now transitioning to a new job with the watershed councils up on the North Coast, right, Celeste?
Right.
She comes with a rich background in plant biology and botany, and she's going to help us navigate these invasive plants that have moved into our area and help us understand what we can do about it and the impacts of these invasive plants as well. We are partnering with a lot of different organizations to bring this opportunity and this to learn and this opportunity to volunteer with you, including Tillamook Estuaries Partnership, the Explore Nature Program, and Oregon State Parks. Some of you might not know much about Friends of Netarts Bay, and so I just wanted to take a second and share. Friends of Netarts Bay is a nonprofit. We're a small nonprofit. I am the only staff person, and then we rely on wonderful volunteers, and we actually have a volunteer here with us today, Janine. You want to say hi real quick, Janine?
Hi, I'm Janine Seidler from Nehalem, Oregon.
Awesome. And Janine's going to help us manage our platforms that we're bringing you this information on today. So, and so if you're interested in volunteering with us after this event, you can always get a hold of us. We're always looking for volunteers who are willing to go out and do really fun things with us or help us behind the scenes. Because, like I said, we're a really small nonprofit, and so we really depend on volunteers to help us get the work done. Our goal as a nonprofit is to sustain the Netarts Bay area through education and stewardship, and we do that by fundraising to bring educational opportunities into the community and opportunities for people to give back and conserve this area. We fundraise to do K-8 education programs where we bring students out into, when there is no pandemic, we bring students out into the field for hands-on scientific inquiry programs. They can deal with anything from geology to, you know, kind of learning about different biomes and forest structures, anything that helps them explore the watershed, estuaries, beaches, and seas of the Netarts Bay area. We also like to do the same thing for the community, you know, families, lifelong learners that are out there. So we're bringing programs like this. We also do programs on birds and geology and salt marsh plants, and we take people kayaking to help them learn about the bay life. And the whole goal of that is that we feel like if more people know about this area, the more they're going to fall in love with it, be passionate about it, be informed about the importance of it, and then they will take better care of it as they are working, living, or visiting here. And so we work real hard to do those things. We also work hard to bring those things at no cost because we don't want there to be barriers to anybody participating. That said, it does take a lot of resources to bring that to you. So the way we support it is through grant funding, but also through private donations. So if you're willing and have the means and feel like what we're doing is valuable to support us, it would be a great benefit to us. So we would really appreciate that. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Celeste. Celeste Lebo is here. And Celeste, I would love for you to share it with us a little bit about your background as well. Going out in the field with Celeste is probably one of the greatest things I've done. It's such a joy. She's a gifted interpreter. She shares her love for the natural world in such a beautiful way. And I wish that we could have you go out with Celeste, but of course, that's not an option right now. So, but when this all clears up and the future is there, I hope Celeste, you will come and take a walk with us so that you can share your love for the natural world with us because you do it in such a wonderful way. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand it to Celeste. Please monitor.
Thank you very much, Chrissy. I'm really excited to be here today and be a WEBS volunteer. And as Chrissy mentioned, as I mentioned, Chrissy and I came up with, well, Chrissy came up with the cool name, Weed Detectives, but we came up with this project through my work at Oregon State Parks. Each of the parks are, part of our policy is that each of the areas have an integrated pest management plan, which is basically just a strategic plan for how you will manage the invasive plants that are in the parks or in your area. And it's often a really onerous task for the parks to accomplish because there's so much other work that needs to be done with managing the campgrounds and working with customers and taking care of recreational facilities and all of those things that the park rangers have to do. So one of the park ranger that was assigned to do the integrated pest management plan often works with webs, and we started talking, and we thought that one of the things that's really hard is for the parks to get the weeds mapped in each of the parks. And so we worked with the folks up in the headquarters at Salem. There's a fellow there that's really good with technology, and he set up 2 surveys for us to use in a program called Survey 123. It's a free program. It's, if you're familiar with ArcGIS, it's an ArcGIS program, but it's more of a citizen science mapping program. And Oregon State Parks has been using it, and it's been really successful for the rangers to use it for all sorts of different things, whether, you know, finding marine debris on the beach or weeds or rare plant species. So we decided to use it for this weed mapping project with the Cape Lookout Management Unit. And we've already had a couple trainings, and we were just about to get going, and we had folks that had adopted some areas to map, and then the pandemic happened, and so everything shut down and we were on hold. But we're hoping to get things moving again. And now the parks are back open. There's, of course, facilities and things like that are at a reduced service, but you're able to access all of the parks in the Cape Lookout Management Unit, which would be from Bob Straub State Park up to Cape Mears. So all of the parks in between there are part of that Cape Lookout Management Unit. So I think we're ready to go. I'm going to go over some really basic information about invasive plants. Those of you who have a background in that, this might be a little bit, definitely will be a review, but for those that don't, I want to make sure you have this information first, just so we have a good context to begin with. And just wanted to point out to you this first photograph. If you haven't explored Sitka Sedge very much, Sitka Sedge State Natural Area is just north of Tierra del Mar, which is just north of Pacific City. And this marsh right here is Beaver Creek Marsh. I'm sorry, I'm at the wrong park right now. This marsh is called Belts Marsh. And it was named after the family that owned this property, the Belts Farm. And it's a beautiful marsh. And so if you're ever at Sitka Sedge, you know, you can stay on the trails, but for anybody that likes to explore, definitely jump into this marsh and explore. It's a really beautiful marsh and mostly all native plants. So just to get us in the right framework, invasive species are, today we're talking about invasive plant species. Of course, there are invasive animal species and other invasive fungal species, all sorts of species can be invasive. But in regard to invasive plants, the biggest problem that they really pose is that they change the landscape.
I got it.
When we're talking,
well, I went back to a previous.
Oh, there we go. Yeah,
I muted them.
Okay. So, so invasive plants are plants that, and so we're talking about, when we're talking about invasive plants, I'm not talking about just a non-native plant in a native ecosystem. There are some non-native plants that can live, you could say, harmoniously with other natives that don't ever cause a problem. But invasive plants are plants that can really outcompete the other native plants that are indigenous to that area. And when they do that, they really alter the ecosystem. And so they can spread so thickly and so aggressively that they will create a monoculture of their cells in the landscape. And so a really good example of that is Japanese knotweed. And we'll talk about that species, but in some areas, those that are familiar with the Nehalem River, you can go to some areas along the Nehalem River and the entire bank is filled with just one species, and that species is Japanese knotweed. And so those are the plants that we're talking about today, the plants that can completely dominate a landscape. And when they do that, they really change everything. They change the soil, they change the food availability for the animals and other species, pollinators, any animal or invertebrate that is dependent on that system for food and shelter. They can change sediment loading, they can change water quality. Some of the plants, because they're not from this area, they may be from a different continent, can be toxic to the wildlife that are here on the Oregon coast. So it just really disrupts the system. And in order for us to have healthy wildlife and plant populations, we really have to try to keep invasive plants in check. In a lot of cases, we're so far behind that it's not really possible for us to eradicate some of them at this point. I think it was Mike that was talking about the Scotch Broom and English ivy. I'm sure those are two plants that everybody on this phone call or Zoom call knows because they're just ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And so when we have species like that, we're just really focused on eradicating them in areas where we still have intact native plant communities. That's the only time it really makes sense because there's just not enough money, time, or resources to go after species like that because we weren't aware enough back when these species were coming into the Oregon coast or wherever you're living to know that they were something that we should be keeping our eyes on. So one of the things that I'll talk about in the presentation are species that we should be thinking about now that could become a problem like Scotch Broom is now. We'll talk about that as well. So on this slide, I just wanted to educate you a little bit about the way different people talk about weeds. And depending on who you're talking to, folks will have a different interpretation of what they think is a weed. So the state of Oregon has classifications for weeds. There are A-listed weeds, so those are weeds that are a problem that are not known to occur in our area, but they probably will eventually. So those would be weeds that are maybe in Washington that are causing a really big problem. They've taken over grazing land or they've become dominating riverbanks, but they're not yet in Oregon. And we know that they are causing a really significant economic devastation to those counties. So those are weeds that we really would want to know about. And then there's B-listed weeds that are already abundant but may have limited distribution. And so those are weeds that are already in Oregon, but they may not be, like maybe they're on the west side of Oregon, but they're not on the east side of Oregon. And so we would keep our eyes on those for that reason. And then the T-listed weeds are weeds that come from the A list or the B list that the state of Oregon has decided those are the weeds that we need to prioritize right now for treatment, for mapping, for research. And there's often funding associated with working on T-designated weeds. So if you're familiar with your local soil and water conservation district, they typically receive money from what's called the Oregon Weed Board. And all of that money is focused on treating T-listed weeds. T-listed weeds, I'll talk about some of those in our slides. There are things like I just mentioned, Japanese knotweed, but a weed that's not on there is English ivy. So English ivy is just considered an established invasive plant. And it's really, it makes it challenging because there's usually not funding to treat a plant like that, even though we know that it really changes the ecosystem, because in a sense, just given up on that one. And the same with Scotch Broom. And then there are naturalized non-native species, and depending on how much you want to get into this, I remember when I was first learning about plants in Oregon, and so excited to, I mean, botany to me is a never-ending, it's my passion, and I love learning about plants, and there's always something new to learn. And I was very, very determined to only pay attention to plants that were native. And once I would find out if a plant wasn't native, it would just somehow in my mind lose some importance. And, you know, I was just really just very interested in that. And over time, of course, spending many years trying to manage landscapes and learning and understanding more about landscapes and how they work together, I soon learned that there was a cohort of plants that they're not native, but they aren't really doing much harm or changing the landscape in any significant way. And examples of those plants would be like evening primrose. That probably about a few weeks ago, this plant was very prominent, and everywhere you drove along a road, you would see this tall plant with beautiful big yellow flowers. And that's evening primrose. It's a non-native plant, but you usually only see it on the road, and it blooms for a while. You notice it for that month, and then the rest of the year you don't really notice it. Foxglove is another one that you'll see along logging roads or recently cut over forests, but it often just fades away as the forest begins to close over. So there are these plants that are non-native that are naturalizing into our system but don't seem to be having really big impacts. People have different views about that though, so that's for you to determine for yourself, of course. And then there's some folks that would describe a weed as a plant that's a plant that you don't want in a particular place. It's a weed because you don't want it there, with no other scientific reason for that. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is people have lots of different ways of describing weeds, but what we're talking about are plants that are really changing the ecosystem. So I mentioned earlier about how, you know, plants like Scotch Broom and English ivy are way out of control, and we really wouldn't go out of our way to try to eradicate them unless we were trying to protect a rare plant community. There are species, though, that are moving into Oregon. This is happening all the time, that we would call early leak detection rapid response species. And these are plants, like I was mentioning before with the A-listed species, that we know that in other areas that have similar climates to Oregon, that these plants have become a really big problem. And so these are plants that different weed management areas are working together, and they share this information and hand out these lists. And so these are plants that we would definitely want to know if we would start seeing them in any kind of abundance in our area, because then we would have the potential of eradicating them. And it would be much less expensive than if we waited until they were already established.
Hey, Celeste, sorry to interrupt you, but just your mic is going in and out a little bit again. So
okay.
If you could just make that adjustment one more time.
Okay. Is
Awesome.
this better?
It is right now, yeah.
Okay.
Celeste, perhaps if you would move your chin down. Is it a microphone that's hanging on your earpiece?
Yes.
Yes, that would make a huge difference, because every time you move your head, we're losing you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so here we are. I think this graphic is a really great example of what I've been talking about, where we really want to make sure that we are addressing weed infestations early in their establishment. So when we first started seeing weeds, if we can start hand pulling them, mapping them, just being aware of their presence, educating other people about them, that's the best way to go, because that's usually the least expensive and best way to accomplish the work. Of course, once we aren't able to do that and the weeds become widely established, like Scotch Broom or English ivy or even English holly, and it's really expensive to do any kind of work on them. And just to give you a sense of why invasive plant species can be so formidable, Scotch Broom in particular, let's see if I have that on here, its seed bank will be viable in the soil for up to 75 years. Let's see, Gors is another species that I'll talk about today at the very bottom of the list, up to 70 years. And so you can see, you know, if you're going to go after some of these species, you don't go out and cut them down and then you're finished. This is a process that you'll be probably doing for many, many years. And it is possible to control these species in small areas, but you just have to keep after it year after year after year. So there are some things that you can just do on your own. First of all, just being part of this presentation today and learning more about what plants are invasive in your area is a really big first step. Because that way, when you're out with your friends or you're at a nursery or a garden store, you can start educating other people. And the more people are aware of which species are becoming a problem, the easier it will be for us all to do our own part to eradicate them. You can think about when you're buying seed mixes that you're making sure that you're not bringing in weeds from other places. A really common wildflower species that is in seed mixes is a plant called Bachelor Buttons. It's a very invasive species on the east side of Oregon, and you still find it in wildflower mixes. So things like that, just learning about those different species that are included in just something that would be, you know, what you would think would be very harmless, could become a big problem. Also, when you're purchasing animal feed like hay, you know, try to buy locally and know your producer. If you're going to be working in an area where you know there's a lot of weeds, just make sure that before you leave that area and then move into an area that doesn't have very many weeds, that you've cleaned your boots, if you're using a kayak, cleaning your kayak. And then those that are gardeners, a lot of our invasive plants are often species that started out in the nursery trade. And so for gardeners, learning about those species and especially educating other master gardeners, that would be a really big help, because then we could just reach even more and more people.
Celeste?
Yes, Hope.
One thing I've noticed here, because we have so many woods, is that people are often inclined, if they have woodland around them, to take their, whatever they're tossing out of their garden or whatever they're pruning and tossing it into the woods. And it's not a problem if things aren't invasive or dead, but if they're weeds and they're full of seeds, it's a really easy way to introduce seeds into the woodlands.
That's such a great example. I was just thinking in Cannon Beach, where I used to live on Ecola Park Road, there was a landowner that was throwing all of their yard debris on the other side of the road into this wetland that was along the road. And in that yard debris was a plant called Yellow Archangel, which we'll talk about pretty soon. And now Yellow Archangel is dominating that whole wetland and moving up Ecola Park Road. And so, you know, that person didn't know anything about that plant and wasn't, of course, trying to establish it in that wetland, but it's so easy to do. And so, yeah, either bagging your yard debris if you know that there's weedy species in it and taking it to the dump, or letting it dry out and make sure it's completely dead before you toss it. Those are all good things to do. Thank you, Hope.
You're welcome.
So I'm going to start going through some species that I would think would be really great just to know about. And then those that are interested in doing the weed mapping, these would be species that we would also want to map if we ran into them in any of the state parks. So I've been talking a lot about this plant, Japanese knotweed. There's actually several species of knotweed. There's Japanese knotweed, which is the bottom left species. There's Himalayan knotweed, which is the top left species. You can see how the leaf is long and linear. And then there's this really cool knotweed. It's giant knotweed. And you can see how huge those leaves are. And this is a plant you will not miss. It's huge. And the one that's probably more common, though, or the two that are more common are the two that are on the left. And as I was mentioning, the Nehalem River has a lot of knotweed, and I think most of that is Japanese knotweed. Is that right, Hope? Is it mostly Japanese?
Yes, there's both. There's probably some of all three, but yeah, the Japanese is very common.
Okay. And so these species, as you can just see from the photographs, just really take over and dominate a system. And what's really interesting about Japanese knotweed, or I'm sorry, any of the knotweeds really, is that it only takes 0.7 grams of a root fragment for the plant to start a new plant. So as I mentioned, they're along these river streams, and you can imagine our really big coastal storms, and we have these big high water events, and you know, the rivers get churned up. There's rocks and boulders and logs moving down the river and slamming up against these patches of knotweed, breaking it all apart. And then the water settles down, and wherever those stem and root fragments land, a new population of Japanese knotweed or Himalayan or giant knotweed is established. And so these plants can quickly just dominate an entire river system. And if you're familiar with the salmon life cycle, the salmon are very dependent on invertebrates and different species that live in the native vegetation that's right along the stream bank. And when you only have one plant living on a stream bank or anywhere, you can only serve so many species. And so the number of species that can live and be supported in that area is drastically reduced when the number of plants that you have in an area is reduced. The yellow bush lupin is a plant that I really want people to become more aware of. I'm starting to see this a lot. In my work with Oregon State Parks, I was working between Yachats and Astoria, so from central up to the tip of Oregon, north tip of Oregon. And yellow bush lupin is a plant that I'm starting to see a lot more. In Northern California, it's become as invasive as Scotch Broom is up here. So we definitely do not need another Scotch Broom. It's a very different lupin if you're familiar with lupins, because we don't have any native lupins that have yellow flowers. So if it's in flower, it's easy to identify. The other thing that's unique about it is that it's woody. So most of our native lupins are small wildflower lupins with purple flowers. This plant, if it has a woody base and it gets big, most of the plants I've seen so far have been pretty small, maybe 1 to 2 feet, but it could get up to, you know, a large shrub like a Scotch Broom shrub. Here are 2 plants that are already pretty common, but they aren't everywhere. And so I imagine, especially if you're a gardener, that you're familiar with these 2 species. The one on the left is often called Montrecia, also Crocosmia. It's a iris plant. I'm pretty sure it's an iris. No, maybe it's a lily. Hope might be able to help me with that. Anyway, the point is that it has those long linear leaves and these really striking bright orange or red flowers. And at the base of the leaves are these tiny little bulbs. And wherever you see one patch of crocosmia, there's probably hundreds and hundreds of bulbs in the ground for that species. And so if you've ever tried to dig this up in your yard, you'll find that it's just almost impossible to get all of those bulbs out of the soil. So it spreads very quickly. Cannon Beach actually has quite a bit of it growing in the area. Oceanside has some plants that are starting to get established down by the beach access. There's different places where this plant is becoming more and more prevalent. And I think at the very least, if we could just start encouraging people to stop planting it. It's often a very common plant to find at a nursery, and gardeners are often touting it as being a great plant for your yard, even saying that it helps with erosion control and things like that. And we don't need more crocosmia out there. It's already starting to spread. Yellow flag iris is another garden plant, and it's in some places getting very established in our wetlands. If you've ever driven through Rockaway, it's on Highway 101 in the springtime, you see lots of yellow flag iris flowers that have gotten established in the wetlands along the highway. And very hard to get out of the system. I've tried digging this plant, and the rhizomes are huge and they're deep in the mud and hard to extract. So usually the only way to effectively treat this plant, the yellow flag iris, is through using herbicide. These two little ground cover plants, these two geraniums, are species that I have found to be pretty abundant in the Nehalem Bay State Park, back where the horse corrals are. I've also seen a lot of it at Fort Stevens State Park. And then Robert's geranium I've seen at Oswald West. So these plants, to me, follow the Portlanders. Wherever we have people coming from the valley or the Portland area, these plants seem to come with them. And so particularly for those that are going to be helping with mapping in the parks, these would be really important plants to look out for. Shining geranium is easy to spot because the leaves are quite shiny. This photo in the background is sort of showing it, but there's sort of a sheen on the top, and it does look like the leaf surface is shining. It has this very rounded, scalloped leaf, and then the typical pink geranium flowers. And then Robert's geranium, the leaves are much more dissected, they're pinnate, and both species have really red stems. I don't know if you can see that in some of these areas. That would be good to see a photo, but they're very small plants. They're herbaceous. Robert's geranium is sometimes called Stinky Bob because if you're walking through it, you can get a kind of musky smell from the crushing of the leaves. And when they're just allowed to just grow uncontrolled, they'll just grow kind of like wildfire into a forest because they don't mind growing in shade. And so they'll quickly take over an understory community in the forest. So these would be, you'd often find these along the trails, would be a really good place to keep your eyes out for these two species. Yellow Ceredela is a species that is new to the coast. We're finding it here in the Central Coast, and so I do not know right now of any populations in Tillamook County, but there's certainly populations in Lincoln County, so I wanted you all to be aware of it. It's a very striking species because of these long, you're familiar with the pea family, those kind of leaves where you have a long stem and many leaflets along the stem, and a very blue-gray color and very hairy. And this is becoming, it's a ground cover, and it's becoming very invasive down in the Newport area.
Celeste, where did it come from?
You know, I don't know its origin. You know, if it's from, like, a lot of plants are often from South Africa that are invasive to the Oregon coast, or from Eurasia, and I don't remember. Maybe someone could look it up while they're, if anyone's on their computer right now.
Well, and I guess, is it a garden escapee?
Yeah, I do believe that it is. Right, one of the biggest populations down here is at the Hatfield Marine Science Center. So it's fine being pretty close to the salt spray. So yeah, I think this could be a potential that could start spreading. This is a plant I'm seeing a lot more of. It's called postal burnweed. And I know in the Cape Lookout State Park, both on the Cape Trail, the North and the South Trail, and all of the trails inside of the campground, I'm seeing more and more coastal burnweed. And partly because of the recent logging that Stimson has been doing up on the hillsides, this plant is really a very early colonizer to any kind of ground disturbance, widespread ground disturbance like that. And so all of those clear cuts that surround the Cape Lookout area are bringing this plant in. The great thing about it is it's really easy to pull. So if you're walking along a trail and you run into this, it's often very tall, 2 to 3 feet tall, has these very long leaves, 3 to 4 inch long leaves. You can see how linear they are, and these jagged teeth on the side. And then the flower heads are very inconspicuous. There's not really a petal, just these small little tufts of ray flowers at the top. If you ever see this plant, just yank it and put it up high and dry in the crotch of a tree branch or on top of some salal or something like that to let it dry out. And I think we could get a handle on this. I'm never seeing tons of it, and I'm always pulling it when I see it. So I think this could just be one that you could just get in the habit of pulling when you see. We could stay on top of it. Here's our old friends, the Brooms. Scotch Broom, of course, you're all very familiar with. This is its cousin, Gors. And Gors is in Lincoln County, and it's in Clatsop County. And I am not aware of a population in Tillamook County. So if we can keep Tillamook County Gors free, that would be a pretty great thing to do. If you've ever been near Gors or touched it, it has very, very sharp spines. All of these projections coming out are not leaves, those are hard spines. And so you know it when you found it. It's really an highly armored plant and very hard to control. And even using, I know some people on the South Coast have been testing all sorts of different ways to treat gorse because it's become widespread on the South Coast of Oregon. They've been mowing it and burning it and spraying it with herbicide. There's also some biological control agents that have been used, which are often what will happen is like this plant, wherever it's native to, I think probably the British Isles, just like Scotch Broom, in its own place of origin, it had a whole host of predators that would keep it in check. So there were beetles and fungal pathogens and all sorts of creatures that were gnawing on it and reducing its vigor as it would grow. But once a species like that comes to another country or another place that's not where it was, not its place of origin, it no longer has these predators to keep it in check, so it can grow free and easily outcompete the other species that are being held in check by their own system. So what they've done is using biological controls, or where they will go back to the place of origin for that species that they're trying to treat and get a beetle, or maybe it's a fly or some sort of insect that is obligate to that species. So it's really, that's the species that it always targets, is what I mean by obligate. And they'll bring that species over here and they'll test it in a lab first for many years to make sure that it only goes after Gors when it goes after a plant, to make sure that it wouldn't attack our native species. And then they'll take those beetles, say that that's what they're using, and they'll take them and release them out onto a population of Gors to see if they can impact the species that way. And it's been somewhat successful. They've been having good luck with a plant called purple loosestrife up on the Columbia River. And they're using a beetle for that. And it's really helped reduce the population and slow down the infestation. So Gors is a plant that we definitely want to know about. And it looks just like Scotch Broom, but like I said, it's covered with long spines. So you definitely will know it when you find it. And all of the places that I've been finding it, and the new places it's been colonizing, are often in those places where there's like a upland cut bank that's pretty close to the ocean shore. You know, not really in the dunal area, but just back where there's soil development, where you'd find salal and evergreen huckleberry, but you've got a lot of light. Those seem to be the places where I'm finding new Gors infestations in Lincoln County. So I've put English holly in here. English holly was a plant that we were focusing on in our first weed detectives training, because it's really easy to find in the winter time, and that's when we were all mapping last time. And so English holly is a plant that is established in our systems, but you know, it's worth treating English holly plants that we're finding inside the forest. So for instance, if you were hiking the Cape Trail out at the end of Cape Lookout, and you know, you were in the forest about a mile, and all of a sudden you saw an English holly plant, that would be really important to map, because assuming there's only one or two plants in that area, then we could go in and cut that plant and make sure we go back and survey it for a few years and hopefully just eradicate it from that part of the trail. There are some places like down in the campground and others where we might find a lot more of it, because it's usually most abundant where people are. But if we're out in the forested areas where we're farther away from any kind of park development, these would definitely be the patches that we'll want to map. Policeman's helmet is another plant that's starting to get established. Some places it's becoming widespread. They have a really active policeman's helmet eradication program going on in Clatsop County. The North Coast Land Conservancy and the Nicanicum Watershed Council have been working really hard on eradicating this plant on the Nicanicum River. And I've not really noticed it close to the coast in the Cape Lookout area, but you know, that's not to say that it's not out there. And like coastal burnweed, this is a really fun plant to pull. It's really easy to get out of the ground. I would recommend that if you run into a patch and you do pull it, that you bag everything that you pull and take the plants out with you. So that a lot of times with invasive plants, if you leave the plant on the ground, it can sometimes reroot and just reestablish itself. So it's always a good idea to either take the plants and prop them up somewhere where they can dry out and then they can't keep growing, or just take them with you out to a trailhead and throw them in a bag. So this one's fairly easy to identify. The stem it grows in wet areas. The stem is hollow, kind of like a straw, and the plant pulls up lots of water through that hollow stem. It has these long serrated leaves with very fine teeth along the edges. The Then the most noticeable part about it are these beautiful pink flowers. And any gardener that's worked with impatiens, this is from that family. And just like an impatiens plant, when this plant goes to seed, if you touch the seed pod, the seeds explode, which is how it distributes itself throughout the system. And very, very striking and beautiful, but certainly invasive in any kind of wet spot or wetland.
Celeste, I just noticed a new patch of this one actually along Tillamook River Road that I hadn't ever noticed before. And it was surprising to me because I don't remember it from last year. And this year it is along, I mean, it's not just like a couple, it's along a pretty good stretch of tributary to Tillamook River. So anyway.
I think it grows really fast. Once it gets into a spot, I think it can go pretty fast. So that would be great to, I don't know how active the Tillamook Watershed Council is, or even talking with Alex at TEP about getting a volunteer group out there.
Yeah, it'd be great. It's, so close to the native plant nursery too, so maybe just a little swap out.
Yeah. Perfect. It would be good to jump on it.
Celeste, I think that the stems are really, really hollow. So as long as it doesn't have any seeds, NCLC is we just threw it up, pull it up, make it in big piles and stomp up and down on it. And it squishes really easily.
That's right. I forgot.
It's really
that
fun.
Stomping. Yeah. Kind of like
right.
Yeah, NCLC is always having stomping parties.
Yeah. I forgot about that. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. That's it. I mean, this could be very therapeutic. I mean, we're all dealing with a lot of stress right now. So that's great. So this plant is really for those folks that want to take a more advanced approach to identifying some plants. It's often hard to identify grasses, and this is an invasive grass, but it's also a really causing a lot of havoc in the Willamette Valley. And partly because, like the geraniums I mentioned, this grass grows just fine in the shade. So one thing to think about, a lot of our invasive plants really need a lot of sunlight. And so as you know, on the coast, the natural succession of our plant communities is typically becomes overgrown with trees, whether they're hardwood trees or conifer trees. And so we have a pretty shady landscape overall. But so we can often control invasive plants by cutting them, mechanically removing them, and then planting back the trees that would normally have been there. And then over time, the trees will shade out the invasive plants. But there are some invasive plants like the geraniums and this plant, False Broom, that can grow just fine in the shade, which makes them more of a challenge for us. So the thing to really key in on this plant for noticing it is the lime green color. So if you look at this inset photo of the leaves, see how the color is just very different, that lime color. It will really jump out to you compared to our native grasses, which are often more of a darker green or blue-green color. The other thing that is unique about False Broom is along the leaf edge. If you can see them in this photograph, there's tiny linear leaves that stick out on the side of the leaf. So those two characters, the color and the line of hairs along the edge of the leaf, are two things to look out for. If you see something that looks just different, if you're out in our forests, our native grasses don't create huge patches. You'll see a clump of brome here or a small clump over there, but you'll never see a big, huge patch of just thick grass in the forest. So if you run into a spot like that and you see these other two characters, definitely call it out, map it, and then we can have somebody come out and check it. Or if you yourself feel you're very confident in identifying grasses, great, and just let us know it's there.
So that,
yeah.
Sus, on the Facebook chat, we had somebody ask about fireweed, and I replied that fireweed's native, but I think this was when you had the policeman's helmet up with the pink flowers. Could remind some people of a larger version of fireweed in a way. So anyway, I just thought I would share that for anybody else that was on the call if you wanted to talk about the difference between fireweed or touch on anything there.
Yeah, maybe after I finish the PowerPoint, we could even just go, I mean, if we have time. So there's two species that jump into my mind when you mention fireweed. There's fireweed and purple loosestrife, and they look really similar if you're just learning plants, because they both have pink flowers and they have a long spike of pink flowers. And fireweed, as Chrissy, as you mentioned, is native, and it's right now it's flowering, it's at its peak, so you're probably noticing it. The only place I know of in Tillamook County where we have purple loosestrife, which would be it's in the plant that looks just like fireweed but is invasive, is in Manzanita. There's a little wetland in Manzanita that has purple loosestrife, and we've been working with the Wetlands Conservancy and the Tillamook Soil and Water Conservation District to hand pull those plants, and we released the biological control beetles in that area too. So we're trying to keep a handle on that, and so far we've kept it contained to that small little wetland. But those two species, I don't have a photo of either one in my PowerPoint, but those would be two species to become familiar with, just to know the difference. And as I mentioned, when we're done with the PowerPoint, I could probably even just Google photos of them and we could just get our eyes on it. So Clematis is a species that Hope, you might know of another location. The only location I know of in Tillamook County for Clematis is on the road up to the Saddle Mountain Trailhead. And if you see the photo on the right, upper right, that's what it looks like in Portland. Clematis is a vine that can completely overrun trees, can grow up to the top of the tree, back down the tree, and then back up again. It's a really amazing vine. And we certainly want to know about this if it's starting to become established. It may be too wet for it to be on the immediate coast, but I have been seeing it when you get a little bit farther inland, like I mentioned, up on the way up to Saddle Mountain. So you'll notice this by...
I don't know of any other cases, but there could certainly be some.
Okay, right, yeah, especially if it's there. So these vines, as you can see, the stem of the vine is made up of a bunch of smaller ropey stems, so it really looks like rope. That's a good way to identify the stem. The seed heads in the bottom left are really noticeable. They're these long, linear, I don't know how to describe them, wispy balls of fuzz. And it really stands out because we don't have any native plants that produce a seed head like this, so it's something that you'll notice as being different. And then the flowers, I don't usually see the flowers. They must not be out for very long, but when they do, they're just a very innocuous white flower. They're not very small. It's probably about an inch across for the total diameter of the flower, but it's a ball of white flowers at the end of the leaf stems there. And here's English ivy. We all know this plant. I have it in here because I do think that in certain places it's worth trying to get English ivy under control. It's one thing to try to pull it when it's established on the ground and is growing all over as a ground cover. That's really difficult. But at the very least, we can cut the vines off the trees. And as the caller at the beginning of the call mentioned, it just keeps growing back up the tree. And that's definitely what will happen. And every year it takes that extra effort to go around and and cut all the vines and pull them back off the tree. But it's important to do because once the vine is well established on a tree, our coastal storms are so strong that the weight of the vine on the tree can pull the tree down, and then you'll just lose the tree. So I would encourage anybody, especially if you know, just take it, if you can do it on just a small scale in your own yard, if you have a tree with ivy on it. The best method that I've found is cutting a 4-inch gap between the base of the tree where the ivy's growing on the ground and then up 4 feet, and removing all of the vines in between there. And then the vines that are still left on the tree will eventually die and fall off the tree. And then you can just annually continue to pull the vines that keep growing up on the bottom every year.
Also, if you can keep it from climbing, you can keep it from blooming, and it doesn't seem to want to form flowers and seeds until it gets to be pretty good size.
That's
and
right.
As far as I know that.
Your audio cut out for me, Hope, but as you were mentioning, once the leaves are able to get to the very top of the tree, it can produce berries. And then that's another way that it spreads, because the berries are very attractive to birds. And so the birds will, you know, of course, spread the berries all through the forest. And this is another one that produces dark blackberries. English ivy also has dark blackberries that it produces. This is Spurge Laurel. This plant has become a problem in Clatsop County. I imagine it's in Tillamook County, but I don't know of any particular places to point you to. It's a garden plant, and it's doing really well, and I assume that it's being spread into the natural areas by birds because they're eating these big tasty berries that are on the bottom left here. But it's also has a sap in the stems. So if you were to hand pull the stems, because sometimes when you first see it, you'll just see a bunch of small stems. It has a sappy milk that can cause dermatitis. You want to be careful about that.
Celeste, I had a question from Dana and Daryl. Why a 4-inch gap for cutting ivy on a tree?
Yeah, I don't know if there's like a scientific reason for 4 feet, but what happens when you don't leave a wide enough gap is that the stems can grow back together. And so I think that it's just been a best management practice to at least do 4 feet, because we know that the stems can't reach back together. It's too far of a space for them to come back together. And so that just gives a wide clearance to make sure that you've got everything dead below and dead above.
Good.
Do you have any other to add on that, Hope? Anything else? Okay.
Celeste, there is.
It doesn't seem to grow very fast. But.
Chrissy, did you have?
Yeah, I was actually transitioning back to laurel, and I was thinking that there are other plants that we call laurels in Oregon. And that might be confusing for some folks. So I was wondering if you could just touch on that, like how you know, this is the one we are concerned about as a non-native invasive, but can you touch on some of the other plants we refer to as laurels?
Sure. So I'm trying to think. I do not believe there are any native laurels. Yeah, I can't think of anything that would be sold in a garden store that would look like this. That's a native laurel. So just to start off from, all laurels that we are thinking of, whether it's English laurel or Portuguese laurel or Spurge laurel, they're all non-native plants that are used widespread in landscaping. In Portland, English laurel is a really big problem, but I haven't really noticed that on the coast. Portuguese laurel, there's a huge hedge right along Ecola Creek, but I haven't seen it spread beyond that. Spurge laurel is spreading into our natural areas. So it's a matter of degrees, I guess you would say. Non-native species, garden species are often, you can have them in your yard and they don't go anywhere. They're not spreading, like Hope mentioned. Some of them grow slowly. You don't see them, they're not hard to control. You know that you can plant other species around them and they'll share the space. But some species just are very aggressive, and Spurge laurel just seems to do really well in our climate. And the way that it looks different from the other laurels is by this whorl of leaves that comes out at the end of the stem. So if you notice, I don't know if you guys can see the arrow on my computer. The leaves are coming out 360 degrees. They call that a whorled leaf arrangement. And all the other laurels are more like a standard leaf. They would just come out on the sides of the stem. So with Spurge laurel, the leaves are coming out on each side of the stem in every direction. And then, of course, these big blackberries will really stand out to you.
As you were talking, I'm reminded that the Tualatin Soil and Water had an interesting page on quote unquote laurels, which aren't all true laurels. I'm going to try and find it and I'll put it in the chat box if I can.
That would be great. Yeah, Portland, the Soil and Water Conservation Districts, the Bureau of Environmental Services, trying to think, Tualatin Soil and Water, all of those groups in Portland have really great websites going over weeds. And often the weeds that we are nervous about coming into our counties are weeds that are coming from the Portland metro area, because that's where a lot of our visitors come from. Many weeds are spread by people. So, so that's a really great place, good place to look for resources on weeds and learn what they look like and how to identify them. So this is the plant I was mentioning, yellow Archangel, that's become established along Ecola Park Road in Cannon Beach. And it's very easy to identify because it has this variegated leaf, white and light green leaf. And it has yellow flowers. The flowers aren't out for very long, but usually what you're going to see is what the background photo looks like. And it's really difficult to pull. I spent some time trying to pull this plant, and you can't even really find out where the plant is rooted. It's like it grows on top of air through these wetlands, and it's really hard to get out of these systems. And because it likes wetland areas, those are really sensitive environments that we do not want to, if we can, not use herbicide in those areas, and we would prefer to always use mechanical treatments for those types of populations. And so noticing this plant before it starts to spread would be very important, and we'd want to pull it as soon as possible. Those were the plants that I had to go over, and we can post this PowerPoint, Chrissy, is that right? And then folks can have the list of plants and the photos and can look them up and find more photos of them. Does that sound doable?
Absolutely. This video and the PowerPoint will all be available to everybody. Okay, great.
So as we mentioned, the big part of this project is about mapping weeds. And we're talking, our focus is on the Cape Lookout Management Unit. And so we're hoping that if you're interested, you might want to adopt an area to map weeds. And so things to think about is how much time you have to commit. Some of these places might require more of a physical effort to walk through. Whether or not you're comfortable working alone, with the pandemic, it's probably best if you can work alone or with someone from your household, but you want to think about that. And then, is there just a place that you're always going to? Like you always walk your dog on a certain trail, or you always spend Sundays at one part of the coast. those might be great places for you to adopt because you're there anyway, and you might see something that you can map. So before we get going on the different areas that we want to look at for mapping, I just wanted to go over these specific guidelines that we'll need to follow for mapping because of COVID-19. And this is mostly to protect you and to protect others. So I'm sure you've been listening to all of the news and you've been hearing all of the things that we do to protect ourselves from the coronavirus. But one of the most important things is if you're not feeling well, then you want to make sure you're not going out to a public place. A lot of our parks are really crowded right now. People are anxious to be outdoors, and because some of the parking areas are closed off, people are parking along the road, and this is getting kind of dangerous, and there's a lot of congestion, especially at trailheads. So if you're local, I would really recommend that you pick a time to go out when it's either the middle of the week, really early in the morning, or later in the day when you can avoid all those people. The weekends are definitely not the time to be out and about in the parks right now. You'll want to bring everything that you need for the day, of course. As we mentioned, park services are reduced, so assume that the restroom might be closed there. You want to have your own food and water, and we do want everyone to wear a face covering. If you're out on the trail and you know that you're on your own and you know it's very unlikely you're not going to run into anyone, of course you don't need to have it on, but if you know that there's other people out on the trail with you, please wear a mask. And then you want to, of course, keep 6 feet away from other folks who aren't in your household that you're not familiar with, so you can just step off the trail if you see other people coming down the trail. Try to find a way to give yourself space. Just remember that you'll have to probably bring everything out with you, like if you have any trash. The parks are so depleted right now for resources and staff that even just keeping up with trash has been really difficult. So if you can make sure you're taking all of any trash that you have back with you to your homes. And then things are changing a lot. So right now, all of the parks are open. Some of the things like the Cape Mears Lighthouse is closed and some restrooms are closed. But right now, everything's open. All the trails are open. Some of the parking is not open, but it may change on a daily basis. As you know, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. So just be aware of that. And when you're headed out to a park, be sure to check for signs and see what the latest news is. You can also check online as well. So here are the different areas. This is the most northern location in the Cape Management Lookout. Doing that Cape Lookout Management area. Cape Mears is where the lighthouse is and the octopus tree. At this park, you could adopt just the trails, and so you could map any weeds on the trails, or if you were someone that was really used to walking through forests and could navigate well in a forest, you could adopt the area that is all forested just north of the entry road. There's also the beach in between the Oceanside and Cape Mears. So one of the plants that we're often finding on the cut banks of these beaches, is yellow flag iris. And so that would be one to keep your eyes out for. Oceanside Beach, the wayside down here that says Simmons, that's where a population of yellow flag iris was. It was growing underneath some willows just in the area where soil was starting to develop above the sand. So this would be a great stretch of beach if you walk this beach a lot already to keep your eyes out for yellow flag iris. There's also crocosmia at Oceanside Beach. So that could be one that would be spreading. Japanese knotweed has been found along these cut banks. This is part of Cape Lookout. This is the Netarts Spit. I've walked this spit a lot because I've done Western Snowy Plover surveys on this spit, and it usually takes me, if I'm doing surveys, 4 to 5 hours to walk from the campground down to the end of the spit and then back. So it's a bit of a walk. I don't know what the mileage is, but it's a beautiful walk. And once you get about halfway down the spit, you usually have the entire thing to yourself. So this is really a beautiful place to go, be on your own, and just get just a crystal. We were out there last week on Friday, and the ocean was as blue as could be. There was no wind. It was just an incredible day. And you might even see a snowy plover, hopefully. So this is a really great one to adopt, but this is also quite a walk. So it would be for folks that are really comfortable going long distances. If you wanted to just do a section of the spit, say maybe you lived in Netarts and you could boat over on your kayak and you just wanted to survey the top of the spit, that could be an option as well. We're open to anything. And of course, here's Cape Lookout. Again, this could be a place where you could just do the South Trail, or you could do the North Trail, or you could just do the Cape Trail, or you could do the whole thing. Here's Clay Myers. This is also known as Whalen Island. Whalen Island is a place that we're really interested in knowing where all of the weed populations are here. The primary plant that's out here is Scotch Broom, because this is the place where we could probably have a native intact system. I think it's possible that we could actually eradicate Scotch Broom on Clay Myers because it's not widespread. And because of the shutdown, we didn't get out this year to treat any of the Scotch Broom. And I was out there collecting seed, and I was noticing that the broom is starting to grow more again. And it would just be really great if some folks could adopt this island, because I think that we could actually protect this place. And there's some really unique plant communities out here. This is in Tillamook County. This is the one place where you can go and find a really healthy population of our native rhododendron. And also there's manzanita out here, the hairy leaf manzanita. It's two shrub species that are not common in our area. And this is really going back in time and seeing what the Oregon coast might have looked like. And this loop trail, I think, is only about a mile, so it's a very doable place to survey.
Celeste, I really loved when we went out there and you shared this idea that Whalen Island could be a weed-free island. I thought that was a really fun idea. Like a really, I mean, it's so beautiful there. And like you said, it's kind of reminiscent of what the coast probably was, more like from the plant community side. So anyway, I just thought that was we should make that happen. Whalen
I think
Island.
so. I mean, yeah, we could just all adopt Whalen Island and all work there together. Yeah, I think we should make it happen. So Sitka Sedge State Natural Area has had some pretty recent surveys, and so we have a pretty good handle of where the weed populations are here, because we recently, or Oregon State Parks recently, did a comprehensive management plan, which included a very detailed biological and botanical survey. But we aren't able to keep track of what's been coming in since then. And weeds are always on the move. And one weed that was found here at Sitka Sedge, you can see my cursor, this is a dike. It's called the Belts Dike, and it goes from the parking area and it travels across this wetland over to the dunes. And just to the south of the dike here, we found an invasive plant called Spartina, and I didn't put it in our presentation. That would have been a good thing to add, and I could follow up with that information. But it kind of looks like a sedge or a grass, if you're familiar with that, but it's a very invasive wetland species. And we treated it, and we've been surveying for it and haven't seen it since. But this would be a really important plant to know about if it was found. And so if whoever was interested in adopting Sitka sedge, I could work with that person to learn that plant, and that could be something that they could keep their eyes out for. And then there are always, you know, things that might pop up, especially on the ocean shore, like maybe Gors getting established, or yellow flag iris in the wetland. All sorts of things could move in. And so this would really be a place to look for those early detection rapid response species. And then Cape Kiowanda, that's really, it's mostly the beach part. So if you go north of the parking area and all the way up to what people call McPhillips up here at the north, walking this beach, checking for things like I mentioned, the crocosmia, yellow flag iris. Could be a spot where Gors could be established, I would think, on these headlands. That would be one to look for too. Trying to think of others. And then the very southernmost survey area is Bobstraub. And Bobstraub is a spot where we're finding the yellow bush lupine. And so that would be definitely a plant to survey for there. It's a really interesting area because in the middle of the bit here are a bunch of relic wetland, interdunal wetland habitats that are quite rare and really fun to poke around in. You definitely would need your wading boots, but it's a really neat area to traverse through, and nobody goes through the interior of this bit, so you'd have it all to yourself. And then walking on these outside trails that go along, especially on the inland bay side, really incredible forest in here. It's got, I mean, the moss community in there just must be about 3 feet thick. It's incredible. And then there's these really interesting horsetail wetland boggy areas that I haven't seen anywhere else. And they're native horsetail, and it's just very prehistoric with the moss and the spruce trees, and just a really neat part of this bit that I don't think people walk to very often. And so that would be a fun area to adopt. And then just walking down the whole spit on the sand side of it is really neat. And there have been western snowy plovers spotted out here, and it is the area that is surveyed. So if your attentions go in lots of different directions like mine, you know, you could be looking for plants and birds and butterflies. You could be looking for sand tiger beetles. That's a really neat beetle that you'll find in the sand as you're walking the beach. So lots of things to find out there. So when you, we're going to be going over how to map, use the surveying tool in a minute, but just before we get into that, because I won't be able to show you once we're in the program, is just a way that we want you to document your find. So when you take your photos, you can take up to 3 photos in your in survey 1, 2, 3. I'm pretty sure it might be 2. I'll have to check that. But definitely at the very least, get a landscape shot. So standing far enough away from the plant where you can see the entire plant. And then zoom in if it has fruit or it has a flower or an interesting leaf pattern. Make sure you get a close-up shot of those aspects of the plant. Because when we go back, if your identification, if you're not quite sure that's the plant you're thinking of, then that would be easy for whoever's checking your observations and records to make sure and confirm that that was the weed that you were trying to map. And we were talking about fireweed earlier. These plants that are growing in front of this red elderberry are fireweed. And the interesting thing about fireweed is that it blooms from the bottom up. And so some people get really sad in Oregon when they see the flowers blooming on the top of fireweed because they know the dark days of winter are on their way. All right, so these 2 links Chrissy has put into the chat box, and we'll make sure that you have these. But with Survey 123, it's a free app, so you can just download it onto your phone or your computer. if you're using your phone to map, you would want to put it on your phone. And I think the easiest way to do it is to download the application and open the survey on your phone and then head out to go to the survey locations. Because as you know, in the Cape Management Unit, there is very little cell phone coverage. You do have the option of using Survey 123 through a web browser, but you would have to have internet. And I think Bob Straub is really the only park that has really good internet. So you download the app and then you click on these links. And usually I just, once you have them loaded into your application on your phone, you can just open up your Survey 123 on your phone to access either the point survey or the Polygon survey. But otherwise, you can just keep these links handy on your phone so you can click them and head into
So, Celeste, do you have to, I put Survey 123 on my phone and it wants me to sign in with a username and password. Is that?
No, you shouldn't have to sign in.
Okay.
You should be able to do it by bypassing that.
Yeah, just ignore that for right now. I think it'll become clear as she dives in a little deeper.
Okay.
So I just want to do a time check. Chrissy, are we trying to finish by noon? Is that our?
Yeah, that's sort of our goal, was to finish by noon. Yeah.
Okay. We have about 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's okay with everybody else and you.
Okay. That's plenty of time. I just wanted to make sure. So I've got Survey 123 on my computer and I have the application open right now. And because I've clicked those links and I have them saved onto my computer, I have them up. So when I open Survey 123, it'll go to this window called My Surveys. And it'll have all of the surveys that I would be using for my app. And if anybody wants to follow along as I'm going, that would be great. If that just makes it too difficult and you just want to watch me work through the surveys, that actually might be better. And then you can try it on your own. And then if you're running into a stumbling block, we can find a way to just talk by phone and I can help you work through it.
Just as a reminder, this is recorded, so you can always come back and view this as well. But we also have a video specifically about how to use Survey 123 that I can share out after this meeting as well.
Yeah, okay, great. So I'm going to go into the point form first. So there we go. So you click collect. So one thing that's not coming up when, this is how it's going to look more when you use it on your phone. One thing that's not coming up is in the area where it says point, there would normally be a map. And so I had to click it for that to come up, but usually you wouldn't have to click it. Your GPS on your phone would be capturing your location and it would be showing this little satellite blinking thing showing where you are on the landscape. So just to make it more real, I'm going to say we're at I'll zoom in and I'll pretend we're mapping the English ivy that's in the hiker-biker area. I just saw that last week. And so I'm doing a point and the right now, so I don't really even, when you're doing a point location, you just need to, wherever this little pin is at, if it's in the right spot, it's already captured the location of the weed for you. Usually what you do is you would walk to where the weed infestation is and in the middle or as close to it as possible, and then capture that point there. So once I feel like I'm in the spot, like it's got got the location that I'm looking for, and you keep zooming in and zooming in to make sure it's actually where you want it. Or you can grab it and move it and let go and put it in a different location if that's more accurate. Once you have that, you click on the bottom right, this green check mark. So then you've got your point, and it shows the GPS location of that. Then I want to find the species that I'm trying to map. So I could type in the common name or the scientific name. I'll try the common name first. So type in English, and here's English ivy. This is what I was after. I could also type in, if you're good with scientific, Heterohelix is the Latin name for English ivy, so it'll also come up that way. So you can search for it in lots of different ways. You just click the species in the button. And then abundance, first what you want to do is determine how you're measuring it. So whatever number you put in the abundance box, you'll want to have match what your abundance units are. So if I'm mapping some English ivy, I'm probably mapping square feet of English ivy. I'm never probably going to see just one plant. If I did see just one plant, I would click that and say, let's say I saw 3 English ivy sprouts. That's how I would do that. If I was doing square feet or square meters, I would think about what that size is. If you're familiar, probably more familiar with square feet, I'm guessing about 4 square feet in size. If you're getting bigger than, let's say, I'm trying to think of like the size of a room. I think a small room, maybe a 10 by 10 room, would be fine to use for a point survey. But if you're starting to get bigger than that, you probably want to switch over to the Polygon Survey. And I'll show you how to use that tool. But for the Polygon surveys for very large infestations, and you would walk the perimeter of the species of the infestation to map that. But for the point locations, you can just stand in the middle, capture where it's at, and then estimate how big it is. I'm just going to say it.
Celeste, can you say that again? For me, you dropped off if once you get larger than X, you should move over to the polygon. Can you say that again?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I don't have a set measurement, but I was thinking maybe the size of a small room, like a 10 by 10 foot room. So you kind of imagine that. And then if you're getting larger than that, then you'd probably want to go to the Polygon Survey, where you could map the perimeter of the infestation. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. I just missed the dimensions that you mentioned as an estimate for when to switch over, and I thought that was good to know. Thanks.
Sure. And so then you'd want to put your name in for the recorder. And that's important because when we go back and we're collecting the information to put into the integrated pest management plan, and we have a question or we want to follow up on a treatment, we would want to be able to reach out to you to maybe go out to the field with you to revisit the plant or ask you more about what you saw. Notes and comments section, if you saw anything that was unusual, if you've been hiking for a long time and this is the first time you've seen anything like this, those would be good things to know, just things that stand out to you and seem unusual. And then here's the area where you would take your photo. And so you would click the camera button, and I'm not sure what it's going to take a photo of, hopefully not me. If it's your phone, it would bring up the plant that you're trying to do. And so you would snap a photo, and you can take, after you take the photo and you go back to this screen again, then you can take another photo. So I wouldn't be shy about taking as many photos as you think you need to document the infestation. You don't want to put too many in, especially if your camera has really high resolution set on your camera screen, because we don't want to fill it up with too much memory. But at the same time, just make sure you're getting enough so someone else could identify that same plant just by looking at your survey. Another way to do this is if you have all of this information, but you weren't able to enter it in the field, but you knew what the location was, you can enter all this information once you're back at your home just off of your computer, just like I'm doing right now. And then when you get to the photo section, you can click on the folder and then search for any photos that you have of that species that you took while you were out in the field but weren't able to enter the survey information, and then load them then. So that's another possibility. And then it records your date and your time. And then when you're ready to submit, you just hit this green X or green check mark at the bottom of the window. So it's very simple. And then once you close it, I'm going to close it and I'm going to lose the changes. I'm going to go back here and now I'll go into the Polygon form, hit collect. So the only thing that's different about the polygon is that you are creating a polygon instead of a point. And a polygon is just a shape or a path around the edge of the invasive plant infestation. We'll go back to the area where we know the there we go, hiker-biker area. So you can create a polygon shape with either the freeform tool or the point tool. If I click the freeform tool, it's kind of like you're drawing a shape around. So just go like this. And this is more effective, I think, when you've collected the data and you know what the perimeter of the shape is of the infestation and you're trying to recreate it back at home. It's not very effective for when you're out in the field. The best tool to use for that, and it'll ask me if I click back on a different tool, it'll ask me if I want to confirm the drawing, and I'm going to say no. Best tool for when you're just out in the field, yes, is the point shape. Because you have your computer in hand and you just get yourself in position and you just walk the perimeter of the weed patch. And as you're going along, as you're walking, walk 5 feet, hit another point, keep walking around. And every time you do, you're just adding points around where you're walking. You do that until you get back to the top. And then if you feel like that shape is representative of the patch of weeds that you're trying to map, then you come down here to the bottom right and click the green check mark. And now you have your map, your patch mapped. And I think what's handy about this is, especially like I was mentioning, there's probably in this area, probably about 20 trees that have English ivy on them. It's not at all necessary to map every tree. Instead, you can just walk through that whole area and get an approximate location and size of all of the ivy that's in that area. So that's one thing I want to really stress. It's important to try to be as accurate as possible, but at the same time, don't make yourself crazy in trying to figure out the exact dimension of what you're trying to map, because that's hard to do in the field, even for experienced field technicians. So just do the best that you can. Mainly for us, just knowing there's a location of that weed out there. That's the most important thing. And so then once you're finished mapping, you can click this back arrow to get back into the area that you're working, and then start filling out the rest of your survey, just like you did the point survey. And that's it.
Do you want to touch on time frame?
Yeah, just, well, first of all, if whatever you can do is wonderful, but what we're thinking of, what's the most that would probably be needed would be go out to your spot 4 times a year. So capturing the seasonal variation of the plant. It's going to be a lot easier to see English ivy and holly during the winter time when the rest of the deciduous leaves have dropped to the ground. It'll be much easier to see yellow flag iris in the spring or yellow bush lupine this time of year. So all of them have their time when they show themselves more. And so if you're out there, you know, summer, spring, fall, and winter, then you're likely to catch all of the different species that we want to keep our eyes out for. And one of our veteran mappers, Shelley, who's already done some work on the North Trail at Cape Lookout, asked, is it okay if I map plants that we haven't talked about that I know are invasive and non-native? And most certainly, especially those folks that have a strong background already and know coastal flora, please map whatever you see. We're just trying to, first of all, get folks familiar with those that may be unusual, may not, and those they may not know about, but also just the ones that are really easy to map as well, just so we can start getting a baseline data set started. Janine, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, Dana and Daryl had a question a while ago, and the question was, is the red elderberry invasive?
No, and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about. What's a weed is really from the perspective of the person who's viewing it. So if you would ask a private timber owner if red elderberry is invasive, they would say yes, because it's one of the most common weeds that'll grow into a clear cut that they try to manage with herbicides so that their tree seedlings will grow faster. So, but it's most definitely a native plant and a really important habitat plant for birds in our area. And I think right now it's really very vibrant because its red berries are out right now, so you really see it.
Just one more question from Dana and Daryl. When herbicides are used, what is recommended? I don't know what herbicides on what. I don't know.
Yeah, it's I'm sure, as you can imagine, Dana and Daryl, it's very plant specific. In my work that I do, that I've done with agencies, some of the folks that, especially on the North Coast, there's a lot of organizations that are trying not to use herbicides. And then there's other folks that have more tolerance for it, you would say, maybe. And there's also degrees of that. So at Oregon State Parks, we would use herbicides when we knew that we would not be effective in any other way mechanically using the herbicide. And so for, in particular, like yellow flag iris, it's so hard to dig that plant up. And as you're digging it up, you're breaking up the rhizomes and you're spreading the plant. You're actually creating more of an infestation as you're trying to dig it out of the marsh. And so the common practice for that particular plant is to use a herbicide called imazapyr, and it has a safe aquatic formulation that you can use, and you would foliar spray that in the fall, and so that's the most effective treatment for that plant. And you would have to have an aquatic herbicide license to spray that plant. And then there are plants like Scotch Broom, where there's an aquatic formulation called Garlon 4A, I think is the aquatic version. There's also Garlon 3A. One of those is the aquatic formulation. In my opinion, I try to go with the aquatic formulation, even if I'm spraying something in the coast, like maybe it's sandy soil or even upland area, because it's a safer formulation. And knowing how our coastal systems are, they're very wet and porous and everything's connected to everything. And so I want to use the least toxic and most safe product that I can. And so Garlon is a common herbicide for woody legumes, and you would use that on Scotch Broom or yellow. So it's all dependent on the plant and the habitat. And a really good resource for that, if you're interested in doing that work yourself, is to go to the UC Davis Invasive Plant Weeds site. You can just Google that. And for every plant that you could think of, they will have a list of all of the ways you can control that plant, whether it's mechanical, chemical, or biological. And so they'll list all of the herbicides. They'll talk about how those herbicides work and the pros and cons. It's a really great resource.
They said thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I think we are at time here. And so, so I think we'll say thank you, Celeste, for sharing all this information. Thank you to all of you that joined